This video is the first in a series of 3 where we will do a deep dive into the L-1 visa if you're looking at expanding your business to the US or acquiring a business in the US. You might be asking, why is that even important and who is this targeted for? The L-1 is a really beneficial and widely used option that allows people to acquire residency in the US without necessarily getting a green card on the basis of a business that they might open in the US or on the basis of an existing business that they acquire. Now, there's a lot of complications involved with the L-1 and a number of nuances that you have to keep in mind. It's not as straightforward and simple, for example, as the E-2, which we do a lot of those visas, and there might be a link below in the description about E-2 visas if you'd like to see some background information on those. But the issue is that the E-2 is not widely available for everybody, meaning you can only apply for an E-2 visa if the country of your nationality or citizenship has a corresponding E-2 treaty with the US. The L-1 visa is very different. L-1 is literally open to anybody. Doesn't matter where you're from, what nationality you have, you can apply for this L-1 visa based on your business activities in the US. So that makes it of appeal to a lot of people. But as I said, there's a lot of details involved, a lot of complications that AI and other artificial intelligence platforms often overlook. So this is a series that we've created to give you a very thorough understanding of the pros and cons of L-1, what are the possible potential pitfalls, what are the advantages of an L-1, and how an L-1 fits into a larger immigration scheme that might include acquiring a green card in the US. So if this sounds like relevance to you and this sounds like your situation and it addresses some of the questions that you have, I highly recommend you stick with this throughout this whole series. Again, this is a 3-part series. This episode, we're going to go into what the L-1's about, who it's generally intended for, and some of the other benefits. Stick around as well for the other 2 episodes as well, because in those we will get into some of the more detailed information about what's involved with an L-1, how do you renew it, and what are your options thereafter. And so let's get kicked off with this introduction to the E-1 with the following questions of really, what is the L-1, who is it designed for, and what applicants or clients are best qualified for an L-1. So an L-1 visa, it's technically called an intra-company transfer visa because you have a company overseas and you're transferring a person. It could be an executive, high manager, or it could just be, highly skilled professional from your overseas company to the US. Now, there's 2 general categories of people, I would say, who qualify for the L-1. One general category is multinational companies, and this is probably the initial intent of Congress when they created this visa category, is that this is intended for large multinational companies. They have people overseas, we're talking about Microsoft, Intel, Google, stuff like that, where they have personnel all over the world, and for various reasons they might have to bring those personnel to the US for, a relatively short period of time, 2, 3, 5 years, to perform some work here, and then they would go back to their home country. That's the second category, and this is probably our larger makeup of our client base, is where the applicant, him or herself, is also the owner of the company. So we have a lot of clients that have their own business in their home country. They've developed it, they've grown it, they have multiple employees, and they're looking to expand their operations in the US. And they might expand it by either buying an existing business or opening a new one. And in the later episodes, I'll talk about the advantages and disadvantages of opening a new business with an L-1 as opposed to buying an existing one. But this is probably the largest percentage of clients that we have where the owner, him or herself, is also, chief executive officer, president, primary employee in the company, making primary, executive decisions in driving the company's growth, and that person also happens to be the owner. So that makes up probably the largest number of L-1 visas that we have. Now, there's 2 general categories of L-1 visas, L-1A and L-1B. I think statistically overall, and with our practice in particular, the vast majority are L-1A. L-1A applicants are managers or executives. So these are people that are overseeing other employees. The difference technically between an executive and a manager is an executive is probably somebody who oversees the whole company as a whole. Managers tend to oversee particular functions. So it could be the CFO handling all the financial tax work of the company. Could be the chief marketing officer, and he or she's handling all the marketing, advertising, stuff like that. This L1A for 7 years, it just means that the total amount of time you can spend in the US is limited to 7 years. With the L1B, specialized knowledge workers, the challenge there is showing that the person really has some unique information, knowledge, know-how that isn't readily available in the US, and that's why you're bringing that person over here. From the perspective of just entrepreneurs, founders, and startup business people, generally they would fall under the L1A. So these are people that are the driving force behind the company. Let's say they've started their company in the home country, they've developed it, they've grown it to 10, 20, 30 employees. Most cases, I would say a startup entrepreneur is most likely to file for an L1A. And usually it's some of the supporting staff, supporting personnel that might come over on the L1B. Now, people often ask, what businesses are most appropriate for an L1 visa? Now, as I mentioned earlier, a very common type of business is just multinational companies, right? That's a very common structure. But I really doubt that a lot of people from Google, Microsoft are watching this video. We're focused more on smaller family enterprises, family or mid-sized businesses that are owned and also managed by the same people. There's really no particular business sector that's appropriate for an L1. Could be construction, manufacturing, services. I would say the most important criteria to keep in mind, and this maybe affects the sector of operations of the business, is the fact that you need to have a lot of employees both in the foreign company and the US company. So unlike the E2 visa, and if you're familiar with the E2, you know that you really don't have to have, first of all, any kind of business operations overseas. You might be an employee at a company overseas, you might never have worked before, but you could still apply for an E2. And once you apply for the E2, there's no minimum employment level here in the US. Most of our clients on average for an E2 might hire 1 or 2 people, but there's no minimum amount. That's where the L1 is qualitatively different than an E2. So with the L1, you have to have an overseas qualifying business, and I'll speak in a few minutes what is a qualifying overseas business. And then at the same time, you have to have a qualifying business in the US. Now, if this is a startup situation in the US, it's okay. You might have 0 employees at the time of the application. That's fine, but we have to show that by the end of the first year of your operations in the US, you'll have probably at least 8 employees, ideally more. So as you can see, with an E2, you only need maybe 1 or 2, whereas with an L1, you're going to need, by the end of the first year, at least 8 employees. And it can't just be 8 window washers or 8 dishwashers or 8 manual laborers. There also has to be a hierarchy of employees, and I'll talk about that in our next episode as well. So that's one of the key differences between an L1 and an E2. The employee structure, the number of employees, their job duties and activities that they do is very important. Both how many employees and what they do overseas, and what they do and how many are you going to have here or anticipated to have here in the US. So it's a very critical distinction with the L1. Another important requirement of an L1 application is that you have a qualified relationship between the foreign company and the US company. So what does that mean, a qualified relationship? There's really 2 structures that are permissible in this scenario. The US company needs to be owned either A, directly by the foreign company. So you might have a company, let's say in Germany, and the German company is the controlling shareholder of the US company. That's one possible affiliated relationship that qualifies. The other one is where you have common owners between the 2 entities. So let's say you have a business, again, in Germany, and that business is owned by, shareholder A. Or let's say, to make it even more interesting, let's say there's 3 shareholders in that business. And let's say for a number of tax reasons or other things, the German company cannot own the US company. So in that scenario, you would have to have the same controlling shareholder makeup in the US. Now, when you have 3 owners, that makes things a little bit complicated because the government wants to see that the 3 owners that own the foreign company, roughly in the same proportion, own the US company. Now, you don't necessarily have to have the same 3 owners. You could have 1 owner in Germany that owns the US company. So again, let's do that scenario. Again, you could have a scenario where you have 3 owners in Germany, but only 1 owner in the US. Now that would only work assuming that one of the 3 owners in Germany has a controlling stake in the company. So if you have 3 owners, but they each own 33%, you would need at least 2 of those owners to own the US company, because no one shareholder has control in Germany. Therefore, you need at least 2 shareholders from the German company to be owners of the US company in order to show that there's a qualifying relationship and that the people that control the US company also theoretically can control the company overseas. Again, if you just have 1 owner in both countries, that makes things very easy. You just have the same owner, overseas as you do in the US. Things can get a little bit more complicated. There are ways to get around it. For example, if you have, let's say, 3 owners of the foreign company, 1 owner of the US company, how can you show that they have controlling stakes between the 2? How you can do that is using a proxy. And we can discuss that at a later point, how you use proxies when the same shareholders are not the owners of both the foreign and the US company. Let's talk a little bit what the benefits of the L1 are, right? Because we're talking about all these legal complications and maybe your head is hurting as much as mine, but there are definitely benefits of an L1 and it's worth going through all these complications. The biggest benefit is, first of all, if you don't qualify for an E2. The majority of cases where a client has the option between an E2 and L1, we probably will choose the E2 in most cases. There are exceptions, maybe if they had previous denials at the consulate, other complications with ownership structure, or maybe they're just not planning to hire a whole lot of people in the US. That might tend to lead to a decision to go with an E2. But like I said, if you don't have a qualifying passport or citizenship, you're not even eligible to file for the E2. And so in those cases and other cases, we might recommend the L1. Now, the L1 is great for a number of reasons. Well, first, similar to the E2, both the applicant and the wife are eligible for a social security number. The spouse of the main applicant receives employment authorization. So with an L1 similar to an E2, the L1 main applicant can only work for the relevant company in the US, but the spouse can work anywhere he or she would like. Children under 21 are also able to join their parents. Once they turn 21, they would have to find some other status that would allow them to stay in the US. And maybe one other benefit of the L1 is the track for getting a green card is a little bit more direct than, let's say, with an E2. And we'll discuss this a little bit in our next episode, but what you need to do for an L1, the L1 in and of itself is not a green card. You could file for what's called an EB1C to get the green card. Now, you can file for the EB1C even if you have an E2 or some other status. But the requirements for the L1 and the EB1C are so similar that it's very often quite easy for people to just get the L1, get things established, get the business launch, and then file shortly thereafter for the EB1C and the green card. And one of the advantages of doing it that way as opposed to doing an E2 and an EB1C is because you have to show that for 1 year of the previous 3 years, you worked full-time for the overseas company. Now, that clock freezes when you enter on an L1. So theoretically, you could come to the US on an L1, work here for 4 years, you're outside that 3-year window, but you still could apply for the green card because how the regs are written, the clock stops when you enter on an L1 and you work here 5 years, 6 years, even longer. You can still apply for the green card and you'd still satisfy that requirement of working for the overseas company overseas in one of the previous 3 years because they look at those 3 years starting from the time you entered the US on the L1. That's not the case if you enter the US on some other visa like an E2 or an F1. So say, for example, you came to the US on an F1, a student visa, and you were here for 4 years studying, and then you said, hey, I'd like to get a green card based on, or not even, let's say you want to get an L1 based on your previous employment for the foreign company. You would not be able to do it because you will have been here already for 4 years. We can't prove that in 1 year of the preceding 3 years that you worked for the overseas company, right? Because the previous 4 years you had been here physically studying or maybe in a different status. So that's one thing, an advantage of the L1 compared to some of the other visas if you're going to ultimately make that transition to the EB1C. In closing, in this introductory episode, maybe I just would like to say, who is maybe not well qualified for an L1? I mean, believe me, we'll do an L1 for anybody, but we only generally want to do that if we feel very confident that the client has a high likelihood of getting approval. So who would probably not benefit from an L1? I would say companies, such as freelancers, where they really have no management structure, they have no company overseas, they just work for themselves. That would disqualify you from getting an L1. Even in some countries, you're able to develop a business using a sole proprietorship. Say, for example, in Russia, we have a lot of clients from there. What's called an individual entrepreneur, it's basically a sole proprietorship. We have clients that they might have 10, 20, 30 employees working for them, but that doesn't meet the requirements because it's not considered a separate legal entity, because we have to show you have a separate legal entity overseas where you've worked for one of the past 3 years. So people like that are using maybe a legal form that's not recognized as a separate legal entity overseas, freelancers, similar situation, or even people that have a relatively small company overseas. And again, we'll get into that in the next episode. How many people do you have to be working at that overseas company to qualify? But if you have a relatively small company overseas, you're probably not going to qualify for the L1 as well, because we have to show that you managed a sufficient number of employees. And also just people that have no company overseas whatsoever, where they previously worked in the last 3 years, that would also disqualify them from an L1. So hopefully this gives you a good taste of what the L1 involves. It requires a lot of proper planning and preparation, both on the business side and the legal side, but it can be a great tool and opportunity for people such as yourselves who are looking at using their business, either acquiring a new business or an existing business or opening a new one in the US in order to get residency here and possibly ultimately a green card. Please stay with us for the next episode where we're going to go into more details about the L1, some of the requirements, what's needed, how do you avoid problems, and how you can get a case successfully done to ensure approval and ensure making a positive transition to the others. Links below with more details. And of course, if you want to sign up for an individual consultation, either with myself or somebody else from my staff, please use the links below. Otherwise, I'll see you in our next episode.